Hi guys, tonight we're diving into a moment that shook medieval society to its core when one lone genius, completely ignored by everyone around him, decided to put a price on something that had been free for centuries. It's shocking, it's bold, and it changed everything. But before we get into the chaos, hit like and subscribe if you're genuinely curious. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you rewatching from and what time it is, because seeing the map light up with viewers never gets old. Before medieval Europe invented taxes, tolls, and emotional torment, there were simple pleasures that gave peasants a sense of control over their small, harsh lives. Chief among them was the communal bread oven, a pillar of hope and subtle rebellion. It was a place where misery met togetherness. You brought your sad little ball of dough, someone else brought theirs, slightly sadder, and together the villagers transformed flour, water, and fire into bread, into life itself. Smoke rose, laughter rang out, and for a fleeting moment, no lord, no tax, no edict could touch them. Then one morning, disaster arrived in boots too big and intentions far too sharp. The local lord, a man who had never smelled bread without the promise of profit, woke to an unsettling realization. His peasants were happy. One laughed, another whistled, a woman claimed contentment. Impossible. Joy spread like wildfire, and fire, the lord knew, could be monetized. He stormed into the village square, eyes ablaze, staring at the oven as though it had personally insulted him. "This is mine now," he declared. "If you want bread, you will pay." Imagine holding your humble dough in trembling hands, staring at a man whose fingers had never needed anything, being told that warmth and nourishment were now privileges. Some brave souls tried baking at home, but medieval cottages were basically paper and flint suggestions. A single spark could engulf a neighborhood in flames that rivaled the fires of hell itself. Attempting self-sufficiency became a perilous gamble. Burn your bread, pay a fee. Burn the oven, pay an even larger one. Complain, and be charged for insolence. Breathe too loudly in line, and face a fee that changed daily. The village's once joyful gathering transformed into a medieval DMV of misery. Lines stretched endlessly. Service crawled. The lord sneered at each patron, radiating disdain. Peasants muttered curses beneath their breath. May a goat sneeze in his stew. May his boots rot in the rain. And yet, deep down, they knew this was only the beginning. If bread could be monetized, everything else could be. Walking, existing, looking at birds the wrong way, everything now had a price. Rivers, once a sanctuary of freedom, fell next. Water flowed freely, fish swam peacefully, and the only danger was drowning, which, in hindsight, seemed preferable to encountering a greedy lord. Communities drank, washed, bathed, and ignored one another's misdeeds along the riverbanks. Life was harsh, but predictable, until one afternoon, a nobleman on horseback arrived, staring at the river with the air of someone who had never encountered reality. "This river is taxed," he announced, voice sharp as iron. Peasants froze mid-sip, their mugs poised in disbelief. "But it moves freely, my lord," someone whispered. "Yes," the nobleman replied, "and now it moves for me." Suddenly, crossing a river required coins. Even standing on the wrong bank could cost you. Wooden toll bridges appeared over streams shallow enough to wade across. Try to cheat the system, and guards board or malicious might demonstrate the punishment in dramatic fashion. Fishing, drinking, watching fish swim, letting your livestock consider the river everything became taxable. Cows contemplating the water now had to pay their own fine. Rivers, which had existed peacefully for eons, were now instruments of oppression, like medieval ATMs that only took money. Grain, too, fell under the Lord's grasp. Every family once had a handmill, simple set of stones, arm strength, and hope. The sound of grinding, a rhythm of survival, now became a crime. The Lord seized this ritual, outlawing home mills. Villagers had to bring grain to the Lord's monopoly mill, a mismanaged, often broken, operation. Lines stretched endlessly, mistakes were punished with extra fees, and the best flour was siphoned off by greedy millers. Attempts at rebellion were met with confiscation or destruction of handmills, leaving peasants with nothing but resentment and exhaustion. The Lord's system was relentless. Bread, water, grain, and even movement now carried a price. Firewood remained the one tangible freedom, but even it was not truly safe. Peasants scavenged, chopped, and collected it as quietly as they could, knowing that any misstep could be punished. It was their lifeline, their quiet defiance, their emotional anchor in a world designed to crush hope. Cold firewood, hungry bellies, the shadow of oppressive lords, the constant threat of fines, the smell of smoke from accidental fires, and the silent murmurs of rebellion. These were the rhythms of peasant life. Survival had become a careful negotiation with power. Every act of independence was a gamble. Every small joy a target. Every tree, every branch, every falling log mattered. It fell off trees naturally. The forest, cloaked in mist, seemed unaware of the storm brewing in his chest. And then he saw it, a peasant, small and hunched, bending over to pick up a single stick. Rage coiled in his stomach like a serpent. He reined in his horse, eyes narrowing until the morning light seemed to shimmer with menace. How dare someone take what was not theirs, what he had not even known existed until this precise, inconvenient moment? By the end of the week, proclamations appeared throughout the village. Peasants gaped in disbelief. They had collected wood from these woods for generations, yet suddenly every fallen twig required permission, a token of submission, and a small but soul-crushing fee. Those who ventured into the forest without paying trembled with fear. Guards lurked behind every tree, in every shadow, ready to leap out with swords and shouting. A peasant caught gathering firewood without a permit could be fined, whipped, or publicly humiliated. Night fell, and the villagers, desperate for warmth, crept silently into the forest, clutching twigs like treasures. Each step felt like a crime against both nature and the barren, hearts pounding like drums of war, sweat mingling with fear as if survival itself had become illegal. Meanwhile, the Baron reclined in his manor, wrapped in silk and drinking wine far more expensive than anyone outside these walls could ever imagine. Sleep eluded him for long nights, but his mind raced with new schemes. Toll roads, fishing licenses, water taxes, each absurd concept more lucrative than the last. Why stop at sticks, he thought, when the very air could one day be commodified? Walking, once a simple act of necessity, was the next casualty. A road, which had long connected the villages, was now blocked by a massive wooden gate, complete with guards who looked as if they had never known another purpose than to extort the living. Pay the toll, they barked at the first peasant who approached. To walk here, you must pay tribute. The peasant stared, disbelief painted across his mud-smeared face. Walking was not a luxury, it was survival. But medieval law, cruel and senseless, demanded obedience. Those who tried to step around the gate were met by another guard, as if the earth itself conspired against them, rising to enforce the baron's edicts. Soon, travelers were forced to pay for the bare act of moving, for the simple inheritance of footsteps passed down through generations. Children carrying turnips, monks with robes heavy with prayers, merchants with carts that groaned under their wares all bowed before the gate, coins trembling in their calloused hands. The river, once the last refuge of the peasants, offered no comfort. Water had flowed freely for centuries, full of fish, reeds, and hope. Yet the baron's gaze could turn even rivers into prisons. One afternoon he saw a peasant lift a trout from the sparkling water, where another might have smiled at the simple triumph of human survival. The baron saw a crime. Ownership, he decided, extended even to creatures beneath the water's surface. Everything within the river, the fish, the reeds, the stones, was now his. Fishing became an act fraught with danger. Licenses were granted on whims, enforced with threats and brutality. Peasants risked their lives for dinner, nets confiscated, boats impounded, or, worse, public humiliation in front of the village. Some nobles introduced taxes by season, by species, or by fortune of the catch. Even fish that leaped into a bucket by accident were considered property of the baron. Survival, once instinctive, became a crime, punishable by fines, public disgrace, or chains. Rain, the last free blessing of nature, fell next under scrutiny. It had nourished fields, filled rivers, and cleansed the air for generations, without question. But one day, the baron noticed water dripping from the roofs of peasants' cottages and felt a surge of rage, as unnatural as lightning. All rain that touches my land belongs to me, he decreed, voice ringing across the valley like thunder. Buckets, barrels, rooftops, even faces wet from the sky, every drop was now taxable. Peasants, soaked and trembling, protested, pointing at the clouds, at the infinite sky, arguing that water had no allegiance to men, that it could not be owned. But the baron's medieval logic had only one direction, downward, crushing all who stood beneath it. Fear and desperation became constants in the peasants' lives. Every action required calculation, where to step, which branch to pick, which puddle to avoid. Children learned early that the world itself could betray them if they were caught gathering sticks, fishing, or even letting water fall into their own containers. The consequences were immediate and brutal. Families went hungry rather than risk the baron's wrath, even as their hearts broke under the weight of hunger, cold, and injustice. Night brought only temporary relief. Shadows hid the peasants' desperate activities, but the ever-present fear of discovery never left. Forests, once places of freedom and mystery, became theaters of anxiety. The tiniest rustle could mean a guard and every twinkle of moonlight on a branch felt like a surveillance eye. Peasants tried to adapt, sneaking through forests at night, using marshes and hidden paths to avoid toll roads and guards. Every trip to the river became a clandestine operation. Every stick gathered was a victory, every fish caught a defiance. And yet, the ever-watchful eye of the Baron or his minions loomed over every village, every path, every riverbank. Survival became a game of strategy, fear, and endurance. Even the simplest pleasures were stolen. Walking to church, once a moment of spiritual reprieve, became fraught with anxiety. Crossing a bridge meant coins. Venturing through a forest required stealth. Fields were cultivated not with freedom, but under the shadow of fines, punishments, and the constant reminder that the Baron's power extended into every corner of their lives. Every footstep, every act of survival had a cost. Peasants whispered of rebellion, yet fear bound them tighter than chains. The Baron's edicts seemed to grow like an unstoppable tide, each more absurd than the last. Rivers, roads, rain, sticks, firewood, nothing remained free, nothing remained safe. Even the sky, once a symbol of freedom, seemed now a witness to oppression. Every cloud a potential herald of taxation. They adapted, of course. Humans always do. Night fishing became an art of silence, of precision. Collecting wood, walking demanded calculation, long detours, and constant vigilance. Survival itself became a performance of cunning and courage. And yet, every success was small, fragile, and fleeting. The world had become a ledger of oppression. Nature itself, once indifferent, had been commandeered into service of the Baron's greed. Air, water, wood, and earth were now entries in an invisible book, and peasants were the debtors. Hunger, cold, and fear were constant companions, as necessary as the coins they no longer possessed. And through it all, the Baron dreamed of more, plotting from his ivory tower, as though life itself were his property, and every living being a coin waiting to be minted. And so, when the peasants dared to point at the clouds, at the open sky, at the fact that water was not a sentient employee of the Lord, they were met not with reason, not with understanding, but with the cold, unyielding force of medieval logic, which ran only one way, from the Baroness' mouth to the trembling ground beneath their feet. This was, of course, nonsense. Total, unfiltered, open-air, premium-grade nonsense. But nonsense becomes terrifying when the men enforcing it carry spears, armor, and absolute confidence in their own stupidity. In medieval Europe, authority didn't need logic. It only needed weapons and an audience too hungry to argue. The peasants knew the new law was ridiculous. Everyone knew it. Even the guards enforcing it occasionally squinted at the decrees, like they were trying to solve advanced mathematics with half a brain cell. But stupidity backed by steel becomes law, and law becomes fear, and fear becomes survival. So people adapted, the way oppressed people always do, quietly, desperately, and with far more creativity than their overlords ever gave them credit for. Rainwater collection became a criminal activity, secret, forbidden, potentially fatal. Villagers hid barrels behind houses like contraband. They positioned wooden buckets under eaves in the dead of night, timing each drop like thieves cracking a treasure vault. Some even cupped their hands during storms, glancing around like they were handling precious gemstones instead of sky juice. But the Lord's guards were relentless. They patrolled during rainstorms with the same exaggerated purpose modern mall security uses when chasing teenagers for loitering. Boots splashed through mud. Lanterns bobbed. Spearmen marched with all the dignity of wet chickens. People were fined for hoarding moisture. One woman was accused, with a straight face, of stealing atmospheric resources. A man was charged for sprinting outside with a bucket during a drizzle. His crime formally recorded as attempted precipitation theft, a phrase so absurd it probably made the quill itself wince as the scribe wrote it. Little by little, nature itself became property. Rain was no longer free. Wind, by extension, was probably next. And the sun, well, if nobles could have bottled sunlight, they absolutely would have sold it back at a 300% markup. Rain became a symbol of everything wrong with feudal power. To own the sky was to own life. And just when peasants thought it couldn't get worse, grass, yes, grass, became the next victim. For centuries, grass had been the one resource too boring and too abundant for even the greediest noble to monetize. It grew everywhere, required zero maintenance, and tasted like sadness, which made it perfect for cows, goats, sheep, and during famines, desperate humans. Livestock wandered freely across communal fields, nibbling happily and contributing to medieval society in the only way animals ever did, by chewing loudly and ignoring politics. But then came the day, the moment, the spark that ignited a new era of idiocy. A nobleman rode past the commons and witnessed something horrifying: peasant animals eating grass for free. His noble brain, unburdened by agricultural knowledge or empathy, immediately spiraled into panic. Free grazing meant healthier animals. Healthier animals meant more wool, more milk, more meat, and more resources for peasants. Meant they might develop dangerous thoughts, such as, "Why are we starving while you have 12 kitchens?" This was unacceptable. So the noble invented grazing rights, which sounded official, but was essentially, "I'm charging you for the grass literally growing out of the earth." The declaration was delivered with sacred seriousness, as if he uncovered some ancient universal truth, rather than inventing an excuse to be paid for something cows had already been eating for several million years without ever asking permission. From that moment, all grass, standing, flattened, half-chewed, or merely hypothetical, belonged exclusively to the Lord. If a cow looked at grass, that was trespassing. If a goat walked near grass, that was attempted theft. If a sheep thought about grass, that was conspiracy. The commons transformed overnight into a legal disaster zone. Shepherds now had to escort their animals like exhausted medieval mall cops, constantly watching the horizon for the baron's tax collectors, who lurked behind bushes like underpaid paparazzi. Peasants attempted diplomacy. Approaching the baron with trembling modesty, "My lord," they explained carefully, "this grass has always been free." The baron, a man whose soul resembled a cold potato, replied, "It is free, for me." His smile did not reach his eyes, perhaps because his eyes had never hosted a smile before. Soon, families were spending half their income just to let their animals eat. Peasants fed the animals. The animals fed the Lord's taxes, and the Lord fed on the satisfaction of monetizing photosynthesis. A few bold rebels began sneaking animals onto common land during moonlit hours. These night missions resembled low-budget heists, shadowy figures, whispering shepherds, and sheep who had no idea they were involved in organized crime. Their prize wasn't jewels, just grass, glorious criminal grass. And through all this beer, the most sacred medieval necessity also became regulated. Peasants didn't love beer because it tasted good. It didn't. Medieval beer tasted like depression diluted in wet hay. But water could kill you. Beer, on the other hand, killed you slowly, which made it the healthier choice. Since beer was the only safe liquid, peasants brewed at home. Every household had a cloudy, weak, questionably flavored recipe passed down through generations. Then a councilman, whose personality could be described as beige, discovered something horrifying. People were enjoying beer without paying him. This revelation caused a noble meltdown, complete with sighing, pacing, and perhaps an emotional support goblet. He introduced an ale tax. Now beer required government approval. Village inspectors roamed around sniffing for unlicensed joy. A woman making stew could be interrogated. What's in the pot? And there was no correct answer. To brew legally, peasants had to visit the ale conner, a professional beer taster whose liver was more concept than organ. He would judge your beer like a priest determining whether a miracle had occurred. If your buyer passed, you paid a fee. If it failed, you still paid a fee. Under this new tyranny, brewing became an underground art. Families brewed at night. Children served as lookouts. Neighborhoods invented coded signals, whistle patterns, candle flickers, pan bangs, anything to alert each other if a tax collector approached. Beer, once a lifeline, became a symbol of corruption, oppression, and the unshakable medieval belief that if something brought happiness, someone should be taxed for it. Forests, once nature's free supermarket, were next to fall. Peasants relied on forests for mushrooms, firewood, herbs, and the occasional emotional breakdown, far from judging eyes. It wasn't glamorous, but at least it was free, until the kings discovered forests, not the ecology, not the biodiversity, just the potential for profit. Almost overnight, many woodlands were reclassified as royal forests, which sounded majestic, but actually meant, touch anything, and we ruin your life. Peasants were stunned. The forest had been their support system for generations. Now, it belonged to nobles, who used it for hunting parties, massive parades of horses, dogs, banners, and loud trumpets that scared every living creature into the next county. Killing a king's deer became a crime equal to treason. In some places, killing a peasant was less serious than killing a deer. If a noble trampled you during a hunt, you were expected to apologize for existing in an inconvenient location. Royal restrictions tightened until even entering the forest became cause for fines or imprisonment. Guards patrolled the trees, scanning the underbrush like they were searching for criminals instead of exhausted villagers gathering firewood. But survival doesn't bow easily. Peasants still needed the forest. So, just as they had with rain and beer and grass, they turned to the night. Some peasants tried sneaking in at midnight, moving between branches like desperate, underfed ninjas. Their steps soft, their breaths shallow. The entire forest held its breath with them. They gathered mushrooms, roots, herbs, twigs, anything that wouldn't betray them with a snap or crunch. The forest was no longer a refuge. It was a battlefield of silence, and through the dense canopy, through the chilling wind, through the oppressive darkness, they continued their mission, every movement careful, every heartbeat loud. They navigated the shadows, driven by necessity, haunted by fear. They moved through the forest in terrified silence. Every snapped twig felt like a death sentence. Every owl sounded like a guard shouting, and heaven forbid they accidentally encountered a deer, then they would have to pretend they hadn't seen it, hadn't noticed it, and certainly hadn't had any ideas about hunting it. A simple walk through the forest became a masterclass in pretending nature did not exist. The woods, once a place of comfort and quiet, transformed into yet another monument to medieval inequality. Trees didn't change, laws did. With the stroke of a quill, the forest became a gated community, and peasants became trespassers in the very world they relied on to survive. All it took was one nobleman to decide, if it grows, moves, or breathes on my land, I should be paid for it. This immediately turned nature into a subscription service. Marriage wasn't spared either. In theory, marriage in the medieval world was supposed to be simple. Two exhausted humans met, decided they could tolerate each other's existence, and then joined forces to survive famine, taxes, invading armies, and aggressive geese. It wasn't romantic, but it was efficient, the medieval version of forming a two-person guild to fight a very angry universe. But then a lord realized something scandalous, something horrifying, something outrageously bold. Peasants were getting married without paying him first. The audacity, the rebelliousness, the unregulated happiness. So naturally, he invented the marriage fee, a tax so absurd that it made love feel like a crime. It was called the merchet, a word that sounded like a type of dessert, but instead meant pay me or your daughter isn't legally allowed to leave the house. Yes, medieval lords essentially charged fathers money for the privilege of letting their daughters marry someone else. Imagine being a weary farmer scraping together coins, not for a wedding feast, but for the legal right to stop feeding your fully grown child. The absurdity didn't even end there. The merchant had nothing to do with the wedding ceremony. You still needed money for the food, clothing, ale, candles, and the priest who would stare at you the entire time as though you owed him money too. The merchant was simply the Lord's way of saying, I noticed you're experiencing joy. Please pay to continue. Some lords took this role too seriously. They kept detailed lists of eligible women like they were running a creepy medieval subscription service. If a daughter married without paying, the lord could fine the entire family, refuse to recognize the marriage, or, in the worst cases, march the woman back to her father's house like a piece of runaway property. Not surprisingly, peasants tried pushing back. Some attempted secret weddings at night, officiated by sympathetic monks who had long stopped asking why anything in the world worked the way it did. But secrecy was difficult in villages where walls were thin enough to hear a fly sneeze. News traveled quickly, and the Lord's tax collectors traveled even quicker. not for safety, because the bridge's wobbling suggested it had a personal vendetta against gravity. If peasants attempted to ford the river instead, believing drowning preferable to the toll, the Lord introduced fines for illegal bypassing of authorized infrastructure. A farmer could cross the bridge and lose a week's wages. The bridge eventually became the perfect metaphor for medieval rule: flimsy, overpriced, barely functional, and profitable only to the one person who didn't use it. Then came the monopoly on survival itself. Peasants were forbidden from grinding their own grain and were instead forced to use the Lord Esmilla structure that shook and groaned like it was contemplating self-destruction. Illegal: brewing beer in your own kitchen. Illegal and punishable by fines for unauthorized fermentation of phrase that made it sound scientific rather than oppressive. Markets didn't escape taxation either. Originally lively gatherings full of shouting chickens and questionable hygiene, medieval markets were chaotic but free. But then a lord walked by and discovered something deeply offensive: peasants trading goods without paying him for using his dirt. Thus the market gate appeared, then the entrance fee, then the stall fee. By the end of the Middle Ages, one truth had become painfully clear: nothing stayed free for long. If something brought joy, comfort, or convenience, a nobleman would appear eventually, holding a scroll and a smirk, ready to slap a fee on it. And so medieval life marched forward under a logic so absurd it looped back into brilliance. If something existed, the Lord owned it. If he didn't own it, he claimed it. If he claimed it, he taxed it. None of these ideas became permanent, not for lack of enthusiasm, but because no one could figure out how to invoice sunlight. Eventually, peasants accepted their fate. They lived, worked, suffered, paid, and prayed that the next generation might be taxed slightly less aggressively for breathing. Little did they know that the future would invent parking meters, subscription fees, in-app purchases, and airline baggage charges. A comforting reminder that while the Middle Ages ended, the mindset behind medieval taxation absolutely did not, and humanity has been paying ever since.